Okay, pertaining to the seven judgment of God, the next judgment is the judgment seat of Christ, and the subjects are only believers, according to 2 Corinthians 5, verse 10. The word "we" is used 26 times in that chapter, and always refers to believers. Further, since no one in judgment go to hell, it is for believers only. In 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 14 through 15, Galatians chapter 6, verse 8, Ephesians chapter 6, verse 8, Colossians chapter 3, verse 24 explains that. And then, now that we know the subjects, the time is between the rapture and the second coming of Christ, according to Luke chapter 14, verse 14. And the place is in heaven after the rapture. And that's according to Romans chapter 14, verse 10, and 2 Corinthians 5, verse 10. Now, the results of this believer is to the believer rewards or loss of rewards, but he himself shall be saved, according to 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 11 through 15. This is a judgment that all believers of this age of grace, the church age, will participate in. That's 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 9 through 10, and 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 12 through 15. And these passages are limited by context to believers, according to 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 5 through 8. The language in these verses assures us that Paul is referring to believers. Therefore, it is believers that stand before the judgment seat of Christ. We can also see in Romans chapter 14, verse 10, that the words "we" and "brother" limit the passage to believers. The judgment seat of Christ will be at the rapture or the catching up of the body of Christ, the church, and as explained in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 13 through 17. First, there is a resurrection of those that are asleep or who have died in the Lord, and their soul and spirit are now reunited with their incorruptible body. Next, there is the resurrection of the living believers whose bodies are changed to incorruptible bodies. Both meet the Lord in the air, followed by an examination before the judgment seat of Christ. And it's according to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 51 through 53. As noted above, there will be no non-believers at this judgment. Non-believers will appear for judgment at the judgment of the wicked dead, or the great white throne judgment. The judgment seat of Christ is not for punishment for sins committed by believers. The sins of believers were judged at the cross. This is a place where rewards will be given or rewards lost, depending on how one has used their life for the Lord. That you'll find in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 11 through 15. It is a place where crowns are given. This judgment is not related to salvation, since the subjects are all believers. There are some groups that believe in a general judgment and a general resurrection. By saying this, they mean that everyone, whether lost or saved, will be resurrected at the same time and will be judged at the same judgment. This general judgment, they say, is to determine whether they are saved or lost. By comparing the time, place, and the ones that are being judged at each of the judgment we are looking at now, we can begin to see that the times, places, and the ones being judged are different, and therefore the judgment seat of Christ and the great white throne judgment are two different judgments with two different subjects at two different times. The ones that believe in the general judgment usually use the amillennial interpretation of the Bible, which spiritualizes or allegorizes prophecy references. And some preachers I've had tell me that the entire Bible is to be spiritualized, and that's not true. The Bible is to be taken literally as it is written, and then no one can change it like the amillennials and the false teachers do. Whether we go to heaven or hell is determined solely on what one has done with Jesus Christ while alive on this earth. And that's in John chapter 3, verse 36. And in that verse, we see a group that is believing on the Son and another group that is not believing on the Son. Note also that the group that believes doesn't have to wait for a general judgment to know whether they have everlasting life. The verse clearly states that a believer has, meaning right now, everlasting life. If a believer has everlasting life right now, then this everlasting life lasts forever. Believers will be judged at the judgment seat of Christ. The believer's sins were paid for by Jesus Christ on the cross. And when one believes, his sins are forgiven and forgotten and cast as far as the east is from the west. And there's a lot of other references for that, but here's a couple. Psalms chapter 103, verse 12, and Titus 2, verse 14. When one believes, their sins are blotted out, according to Isaiah 43:25. And at the judgment seat of Christ, believers will be judged on their service to determine their rewards. None of those at the judgment seat of Christ will go to hell. When one believes, they are no longer under condemnation of God and shall not come into condemnation again, according to John chapter 5, verse 24, and Romans chapter 8, verse 1. The second group, which is the unbelievers, will be judged at the great white throne judgment and will be judged according to their works, according to Revelation chapter 20, verse 12. So if one wants to be saved by doing good works, then one must have never violated any one of the Ten Commandments. The Bible says that all of our works are as filthy rags in Isaiah chapter 64, verse 6. So none of those at the great white throne judgment will go to heaven. And that is in Revelation chapter 20, verses 14 through 15. And again, thank you for listening.